Recently, the Society for Vascular Surgery decided to put together a video archive interviewing many of the important leaders and innovators in vascular surgery so that there would be a readily accessible library for younger people to look at to better understand the background of the development of our field. And the archive committee is composed of Dr. James Yao, Dr. Cal Ernst, Dr. Norman Rich, Roger Gregory. And recently, the committee has recruited me, Walter McCarthy, Mark Eskandari, and Peter Lawrence to help with the effort in the interviews. And today, we are happy to have Dr. Ronald Baird with us, who is one of the distinguished surgeons, who's a Canadian surgeon, and has practiced vascular surgery and cardiac surgery in Toronto, and also held leadership positions in most of the important Canadian societies of cardiovascular surgery and also other societies in the United States, so has quite a perspective both from the clinical standpoint and from the leadership standpoint. Welcome. Thank you for coming to Chicago and helping with this project.
Thank you.
You're
Very
from
pleased
Toronto.
To be here.
You're from Toronto. You've done all your training there.
Yes, I was born in Toronto and educated in Toronto. I finally finished my postgraduate training in '59, and it was a pattern of practice in Toronto at that time that if you were going on to a academic position that you should see the rest of the world. So I traveled then for 6 months and saw, very fortunately, I met all the leaders in the United States, Europe, elsewhere, and then went back to Toronto. Canadian surgeons are, of course, very involved with the U.S., and all the big meetings are in the U.S., so I've been down here many, many times and greatly appreciate it.
How did you decide to go into to become interested in vascular and cardiac surgery after you'd done the general surgery that we all did?
It's a matter of timing, Walt. I was born in '30, so I was in medical school from '48 to '54, and that's when it all happened. The first open heart surgeries, first valve surgeries. First vascular surgeries of any note. It was quite obvious that this was an opening field. So I trained in general surgery, but the people I was training with were swinging themselves to vascular and cardiac. So my first examination was in general surgery, but I never really practiced general surgery. I immediately started first mainly vascular, and then as the pump developed, and of course eventually with coronary bypass, I got pushed more and more to cardiac.
Who were in your training? Who were your favorite teachers and your mentors that steered you in this direction?
Well, again, we were very fortunate in Toronto. The school's reputation, I think, could be said was made by Banting with insulin's discovery in '21. And thereafter, there were a number of advances. My particular teachers were Gordon Murray, Bill Bigelow, and Bill Mustard. And all of them were very prominent by the time I was graduating in medicine. Gordon Murray had been the first surgeon to have access to heparin in 1937, and he had it for almost a monopoly for 4 or 5 years. So all the initial papers on heparin, how to use it, what the dose is, what it's good for, and so on, came out of Toronto and made him a very famous man. The main influence on my career was Bill Bigelow. And he came to prominence in '52, '53, first for the description of the first pacemaker, cardiac pacemaker, and then the use of hypothermia, of cooling the body down so you could stop the heart for 8 minutes instead of 4 minutes, which was a tremendous advance. And the third was Bill Mustard, who is famous for so-called mustard operation for transposition of the great vessels, contributions to pediatric surgery. So I spent a year in Bigelow's lab studying hypothermia and how to cool the body further than normally we could. And then I spent a year as his resident, and then a year at Bill Mustard's resident at Sick Children's Hospital. So I was very lucky in my timing.
So you did a lot of congenital heart surgery early on.
As a resident?
Yeah, as a resident.
Canadians tend to be a little more socialistic than Americans, and they concentrate things to, like, our railroad was run by the government, our airline was run by the government. Well, our hospitals, to some extent, concentrated things. So the Hospital for Sick Children would draw all the sick children across the country, really. So there were tremendous concentrations of people. Once I went on staff at Toronto General and Toronto Western, well, then it was strictly an adult practice. So the only time I went back to Sick Children's was when we went back to, Bill asked me back when he was separating Siamese twins that were joined by the heart and the chest. And so I went back and enjoyed that. But otherwise, no, my practice has always been with adults.
When you first finished, how was the practice of vascular surgery and cardiac surgery organized in Toronto?
Yeah. Well,
were they people on the same service, all doing all those operations, or were they?
Well, this would be, I basically started in 1960, 61. It was just after Kennedy's election. And it was an exciting time because the heart-lung pump had been developed, and John Kirkland and others had got that piece of equipment working, so we had access to open heart surgery. We were still doing some hypothermic surgery in which the patient was wrapped in ice to drop his temperature before you opened the chest. The chest incisions were all left to right across the front. The midline incision, I think, came in 62, 63. There wasn't all that much cardiac surgery to do in the adult because it was mostly valves, and we weren't very good on valves. The star valve hadn't come in yet. The valves we had were primitive. We could do congenital lesions that had been left unfixed, atrial septal defects, ventricular septal defects, but there wasn't a lot. And in those days, the great push was to increase your volume, because unless you were doing 2 or 3 cases a month anyway, your expertise wasn't considered as good as the people who were doing more. There was a lot of vascular surgery around. People were smoking like chimneys in the 60s, and so there was a lot of obstructive femoral disease. The women were on the birth control pill, which wasn't very good, and they were blocking their arteries. There was a lot of surgery for that. The abdominal aneurysm surgery was just being revolutionized by the contributions of DeBakey and others, that you didn't have to take it out, you could just repair it. So I practiced basically 80%, I would say, most of vascular surgery, and enjoyed it because it was burgeoning. Every month there'd be a new approach to something.
How were you repairing aortic aneurysms when you first started in practice?
The time I came along, we were not removing them. The original ones have been done by my colleagues, Bigelow, and the other colleague who's very important in my training is Donald Wilson, whose name will come up. He's not that well known in the United States. But they did the first 2 abdominal aneurysms in Toronto, and I think they did them 53, 54. And they were removing them in those times. But once the idea of using a homograft or a prosthetic graft and putting it inside, that took off. So we had the Dacron grafts, Teflon grafts. The sutures all changed. Things I remember is that all the surgeons had to learn to deal with the midline incision. Before that, general surgeons who were doing gallbladders and stomachs and so on had a paramedian incision, which was 5 inches or 4 inches. When we got onto these 12-inch incisions down the center, it was a real problem learning how to close them so that they stay closed and you wouldn't get a hernia. And so we went through a lot of different techniques with wire sutures, interrupted wire sutures, and then the development finally of the various plastic sutures, Prolene, what have you, came along, made all that very simple.
In the early 60s, what suture were you using to sew in your Dacron grafts?
We would be using silk originally.
You were using silk. Did you have trouble with that?
Not that we were aware of. I think any trouble with silk would come a long time after. It held for the 4 or 5 years that I'd be involved with that. Mm-hmm. It was not as permanent a suture as Dacron and some, which once they're sewn in, that's a permanent suture. Mm-hmm. And they also, the needles were, the development of needle technology is very different. Mm-hmm. When I was training as a resident, we used to have to wear a thimble to drive the needle through the skin. Otherwise, you'd end up with your finger all bloodied from the dull needle. And yet the nurse had to thread the needle with the silk and then hand it up. All that changed very rapidly in the 60s as needle technology and swedging the suture onto the needle occurred, and then the sutures got smaller and smaller, as they had to be once you started to do coronary artery surgery or smaller surgery. When you're dealing with a pipe the size of a hose, it's a very different method of sewing than when you're dealing with something like a drinking straw.
And so after silk, then the braided Dacron suture came along. And then what about polypropylene?
Yeah, it came in there. I can't remember the various, but they became quite obviously much easier to use. The great problem was then how to tie them. Remember, they were slippery.
Right.
If you put 2 or 3 knots on a silk, it's held, but these things were so slippery you had to put 5 or 6 knots on. Mm-hmm. And that took time. We had to learn. But the advances that occurred essentially every month were unbelievable. Mm-hmm. If you missed a meeting of the American Thoracic Society or either the vascular societies, you'd really missed out on what was going on.
You were interested in renal artery reconstruction along at the beginning of your career. Yeah. What were you doing related to renal arteries?
Well,
back in
in Toronto we had a number of internists who were specializing in renal function and hypertension. And nobody had ever fixed a renal artery stenosis until the 60s. That's the narrowing in the renal artery that causes intractable high blood pressure. So that was right up my alley, and I enjoyed it, and I soon had a huge practice in fixing renal artery stenoses. The other thing was portal hypertension. Nobody today does many operations for portal hypertension, but in those days it was a real problem, and people were coming in with their tummies full of ascites, esophageal varices, vomiting blood, and there was no medical treatment. So I had also a huge practice in portocable shunts, splenorenal shunts, and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So it was a mixture of really anything that was referred requiring vascular repair.
How did you approach the renal arteries? Did you do endarterectomies or bypasses or a combination of?
Mostly endarterectomies and patches. We were patching, and then the bypass principle was used whenever possible. The bypass principle first was applied to the femoral popliteal, I think by a Frenchman, Kuhnmann, and it's a principle we can apply everywhere. Vascular surgery, in essence, is so simple.
That's true.
As you know, so simple, it's unbelievable. It's basically plumbing, and anything a plumber do, we could do, just on a smaller scale.
What were you, in those days, what were you doing with the ischemic legs?
The ischemic leg was a tremendous volume of practice. I think diabetes was certainly prevalent. And the person lying there on the bed with a gangrenous foot or his toe that wouldn't heal or his heel that wouldn't heal was a terrible problem. They couldn't go home. You kept chopping off a little more all the way up. So that there was obviously a great need to fix them. Now, angiography, that's the ability to get a road map of where it's blocked and not blocked, it also was developing very rapidly in those years. So we were getting good pictures of where it was blocked and where it wasn't. So all we had to do was decide what you could correct. And we could take the saphenous vein and place it. My main claim to fame is that I did the longest saphenous vein graft to report it when I did it down below the ankle at one time.
So you went from the femoral
down, well,
to the,
I don't know where we started up here, but we ended up down in the foot. It worked beautifully.
Yeah, and still does.
Well, I think so, but what you have that's different, I think, than what we have. You have magnification with glasses and so. We didn't have that, so we couldn't go into such small vessels. And we didn't have the balloon dilation techniques, of course, that you have now.
Right.
But we would trace, we would go after these ischemic vessels wherever they were, in the intestine, neck, leg, arm.
When did you start using loop magnification? Can you remember when that became popular?
I think that was very late. I think it basically came in with coronary bypass. Now, coronary bypass, you can correct me, but I think comes in about 69, 70. It came in at the same time as heart transplants, which is what I remember, because we were doing the heart transplants and thought they were such a great operation. But within 2 or 3 years, everybody stopped because patients didn't live. The coronary bypass sort of started slowly. Favaloro, the Argentinian surgeon who introduced it, was up to Canada many times. And it was a very simple operation, but it was on small vessels. You're talking about vessels like a drinking straw or smaller. And it was quite obvious then that you saw better if you could magnify. So the loops came in with coronary bypass and thereafter.
Did you do the first heart transplant in Toronto, or were you
in
part of it?
Toronto, yeah. Well, heart transplants are very interesting. The technology of how to do it, of course, was developed by Shumway and his group in the United States. And emotionally, it was a big question, heart transplant. And legally, it was a big question. In Japan, my friend who did the first heart transplant in Japan was charged with murder. And that charge hung on him for the next 10 years. So they had an attitude to that. Once the South African had popularized it, it became very popular because it was essentially a very simple operation. And too many centers got into it. Quite a few in the United States. In Canada, it was started in Montreal, at the Montreal Heart Institute. And they did 4 or 5 with good results. So we went down to see them and see what they were doing. And then we went down to see Michael DeBakey in Houston, watched him do one. And then we decided we'd go ahead in Toronto. There was some controversy over which of the 3 hospitals who were doing open heart surgery would do it. And that's because at that time we still hadn't had a Medicare system where everything was under sort of one pyramid. They were competing hospitals. And at the Western, where I was then, we were doing all the kidney transplants. So we thought, well, we should be doing the heart transplants because we had the technology to treat rejections. So I did the first one, and with my colleague, Donald Wilson, who was the chief surgeon. And he did very well. He lived about 9 or 10 months, but they didn't know how to treat rejection. The other hospital then went ahead. Within about 2 months, 3 different hospitals had done transplants in Toronto. And this was very educational to us, because obviously that's not the way you should go, particularly if you're under one university. So the 3rd hospital, St. Michael's, did one, and that patient lived, I think, for 12 years. He was the longest living heart transplant in the world for a long time. So that's
it remains a fascinating business. It really does. You know, you have written a few times about the ascending aorta to femoral bypass as a mechanism of getting around a complicated aortic occlusion. What's your memory of the first one of those operations?
It wasn't such a big deal.
Yeah.
again, you're looking at someone lying in bed with his feet going gangrenous. And if he's got all his arteries in his abdomen blocked, so you can't take a graft off from there. And where do you go to get the inflow? I think I was taking a number of grafts off the descending thoracic aorta and bringing them all the way down, attaching them to the leg. And they worked very well, but that was a big operation. And by that time, Denton Cooley had introduced the median sternotomy, which was a beautiful incision. It doesn't really hurt as the patient very much, exposes everything beautifully. And of course, if you do that, right under there is the aorta, which is the main source of everybody's blood flow.
Sure.
So there was the source, and here was the end point. So it was very simple to suggest, why don't I take it off here and put it down there? But then where to tunnel it originally? I think the first ones we tunneled under the skin, which was a mistake, because it worked well enough, but the patient was always feeling the thump, thump, thump of the new artery going down. So we found it was very simple to go down under the abdominal wall muscles with a tunneler. Dr. DeBakey had a tunneler. Remember that? I guess you still use it.
Yes, we do.
It was sort of a penile tip thing that you could push, and once you got it down wherever you want it, you tied your graft to it and pulled your graft through. You should go wherever you want it. And so we would attach it to the aorta, put it down under the abdominal wall, appear at the groin, go wherever we wanted down here. And it worked very well. I think it didn't take on because, as you were very well aware, that would be the mid-60s, early 70s, and the volume of cardiac and vascular surgery was so huge that the specialties were splitting. And people were concentrating on only doing heart surgery or only doing vascular surgery. And the meetings started to split, and the societies started to split. So within about 5 years, the people who were treating vascular lesions weren't really very happy going into the chest and dealing with the aorta. I think that was one of the main reasons it didn't go. But anyway, I enjoyed it. I think we did not more than a dozen.
Did you ever put the distal anastomosis in the abdomen? I've done a few of those operations, and
from the ascending aorta to the abdomen. Yeah, I've been involved in that. We had
any tricks to the tunneling there that you could tell us about?
I'm going to forget. I remember one very complex case that was a coarctation of the descending thoracic aorta, plus a number of other things. So instead of fixing the coarc, we decided we'd do the bypass principle, and we went off the ascending aorta down into the aorta. I think maybe at the renal arteries level. I say fascinating surgeries, I think, is far more fascinating than cardiac because they've got all these anatomical problems. If you become a cardiac surgeon, all you're doing is working in that one little organ. A lot of guys, all they do is coronary bypass or aortic surgery or mitral, and they're all specialized so that they only do one thing now. And that's kind of boring.
In a way it is, yes. If you think back at it now, what were your favorite operations? You've done a lot of them, a lot of different
my favorite operation, without a doubt, was aneurysms. And I got very, very good and very quick at abdominal aortic aneurysm. Well, then Stanley Crawford in Houston, again, the contributions of Houston are unbelievable. DeBakey, Cooley, Crawford. It became the mecca of vascular and cardiac surgery. They showed us how to do aneurysms in the chest, dissecting aneurysms, fusiform aneurysms, and they were real challenges. And I greatly enjoyed the arch aneurysms and the descending thoracic aneurysms. The great tragedy of operating in that area is it can end up with a paraplegic person because they didn't have enough blood supply to their spinal cord. And that bothered me very much, and I slowly got away from it because I hated the thought of ever making someone paraplegic. The abdominal aneurysm doesn't give you many complications. If you do it right, you're fine. You got to make sure the kidneys are okay, and your outflows are all right. But it was a big operation with a big cut and so on. I understand now that you do most of them, without that approach.
Have you kept up to date with the endovascular repair of the thoracic aneurysms? That's an
It's all
intriguing
it's all come in
simplification.
since I retired. I retired in '94, and it was just starting then. Do I read the journals, and amazed to see what they can do? Unbelievable.
Now, of course, anticoagulation is a big part of vascular and cardiac surgery, and you got interested in the mechanisms of anticoagulation early on in your career and have followed that. And how'd you get interested in that?
Vascular surgery depends on the ability to stop the blood from clotting, to keep it fluid while you're working, and then you got to make the blood clot again. Now that's a fascinating thing, because how does the human or any mammalian blood clot? How do you keep it from not clotting? If you've stopped it from clotting, how do you get it to clot again? Those are fascinating questions, and the drug which was available throughout my whole career was heparin. It would have first been produced in any quantity in Toronto, but at the Connaught laboratories, and we knew how to use it by the time I was working, and we knew how to stop its effects after we were through the operation. So I was interested in that. Not that I was any expert. As a surgeon, you depend on all these other people to help you, and we had people called hematologists and clotologists and what have you.
Still do, right?
Well, they are very essential. And they were expert. We were in Toronto. We had a great depth in that field. They not only knew about heparin, they knew about snake venoms and all that. So that in my later career, we had a number of people stand up from the USA to be operated on in Toronto because they had reaction to heparin. Every now and then, somebody will do the opposite and clot when you give them heparin. So we had a number of them, and we did open heart surgery using snake venom. So there are many ways of achieving your object of having the blood stay fluid when you're operating and then clotting normally afterwards. The greatest nightmares that I still have are the early open heart surgery with the pump, because the use of the early pumps defibrinated the blood, and so it would stay nice and fluid while you were operating, but you couldn't get it to clot afterwards. And the major cause of death was post-operative hemorrhage in the early 60s. And there was tremendous research going into how to make the blood clot normally. That's a very unsatisfying thing to have done a nice operation and then lose the patient because they bleed to death.
I know you're interested in history of all sorts, and you're a bit of an expert on the history of the development of heparin. And one of the people who was part of that is McLean.
Yep.
And tell us more about McLean. He may be underrepresented in the...
Underrecognized.
Underrecognized.
The story of heparin is fascinating. And I decided to tell it at a presidential address that I had to give in the United States. And it came at a time, which I referred to earlier, when the cardiac people were meeting over in these rooms and the vascular people were meeting over in another room, and they weren't really having much to talk about in common. So I needed an address that would address both, and so heparin was a natural. Not only had it been first used by my teacher and mentor, Gordon Murray, clinically, but it had a fascinating history of discovery. And the man who's given credit for the first demonstration that you can take a product from a mammalian body and purify it enough that it'll stop the blood from clotting was J. McLean. And he did this at Johns Hopkins Hospital in 1916, and while he was still a medical student. And he wrote it up, but not very clearly. And then he went on to practice in other forms of surgery, radiology, what have you, until in 1937, 38, he begins to read about the work in Toronto where Gordon Murray is using heparin and hooking arteries together, and that this product is now available and saleable and cheap. And he sort of comes out of the woodwork saying, look, this is something I first discovered 20, 30 years ago. Now, he goes looking for credit with the person he first worked with, which was Professor Howell at Johns Hopkins. And he was a very famous man. Howell was one of the big four at Hopkins in the 1890s, early 1900s. Osler, Halsted, Welch, and Howell. This is the start of academic medicine in North America. So Howell was a very important man, and he'd made the contributions, and he put the name heparin on this substance. He tried to produce it from dog liver, and he did, but it wasn't very good, and it wasn't very much. And it was only when Charles Best, who had worked with Banting in Toronto, got interested in it that they decided they could get it from cattle liver originally, and then finally pig guts. Most of our heparin today comes from porcine intestine. It's a very complex subject. I don't think, as far as I know, that they can synthesize it to this day. I think it's still a biological product. But anyway, it became, of course, very ubiquitous in its use, and McLean would like to get credit, but Howell didn't think he had contributed all that much, so he felt he was not well treated at Hopkins, and he began to communicate with the people in Toronto and with the people in Copenhagen who were also working on a form of heparin, a chap called Jorpes, Jorpes. So the Europeans had a heparin, North Americans had a heparin, and McLean wanted more credit, which he never got in his lifetime. He died in '48, just when he was about to present a paper on the discovery of heparin. Died of a heart attack. And his son recently, or at least a decade ago, contacted me in Toronto and was very generous in providing information on his father and the handwritten manuscript on the discovery of heparin. So this was such a fascinating story that I told it, and I went over very well.
Should the Society for Vascular Surgery do more to
the son was very interested in having his father's contribution recognized.
Yeah.
And I think he was talking about setting up a website. Now, I'm not very good on electronics, but I checked out your website, and there's his picture.
Oh,
so he's already on your website, and
we made some
so
progress.
I gave all this material that I had, his life that the son gave me, and the manuscripts and so on, to your authorities, and whether they wish to elaborate on that on the website, I don't know.
You have been interested in organized medicine through the societies over your whole career and been president of many of them. Tell us about starting the Toronto Vascular Society. That sounds like a grassroots operation of real interest.
Well, it was. Again, it's the Canadian genius, if you like, for centralizing things. We could only have a heart-lung pump in certain centers, and that would guarantee you had a large volume. But the guys around you couldn't do cardiac surgery. Now, vascular surgery is different. Nobody consciously said it can only be done there. And in the 60s and 70s, the prostheses and material you used were cheap, not like today when they're extremely expensive. So there were a number of surgeons around Toronto, in St. Catharines, Barrie, Oshawa, where have you, who were practicing some vascular surgery. And that's not a very pleasant thing to be doing one case a month. And so they get into trouble. And I would do all I could to help them. But it became obvious that we needed a forum where they could meet 2 or 3 times a year and discuss what they should or shouldn't do and how to do it and so on. So that's how we started, and it was very useful.
All right. How many members were there when you started?
Not that many. I think we'd be a dozen or so. And then as I got more and more interested in cardiac surgery, it dissipated.
The ISCVS is a group that you were president of, and then more recently that's been rolled into the SVS. Do you think we've lost something by not having the two societies, or?
I think it's a complex history.
Yeah.
The U.S. often will start up a specialty society, and they say we're the top dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Then the other guys who didn't get into that will start another society, because they think they're pretty good too. So that was more or less how those two societies, I think, happened in the United States. But the United States, of course, was ahead of the rest of the world in vascular surgery. Soon the other countries, Europe, what have you, had their own societies. So there was an international aspect to the International Society. And they held meetings in Moscow, Vienna, London, where have you. And these were fascinating, wonderful meetings for people from around the world to get together. No, I think that's been lost. I think the Europeans, the Japanese, and so on come to your meetings, but you're not going to go to their meetings. And that's the matter of being the hegemon of the world.
Did you, after you finished your training, you did the grand tour, in a way, of surgical leadership, and you went to Russia, among other places. What are your memories of that?
Fascinating time. Well, you wouldn't remember it, of course, because it's 1960, and it's the height of the Cold War, and U-2 has just been down, and Gary Powers is in prison. And Kennedy gets elected, and Kennedy is talking tougher than Eisenhower. And Khrushchev is, not only have Sputnik gone up, Lunak's gone up, they've exploded the largest nuclear bomb ever heard of in the world. I think it's 10 times bigger than the one the Americans did in the Pacific. And he was talking tough. The Berlin crisis is going to come up, Cuban crisis. It was an interesting time. Now, as physicians, we're not involved with any of that stuff. And my mentor, Bill Bigelow, at international meetings was a very friendly person to the Russians and the Germans, Chinese, what have you. And he made a number of Russian friends, and between the two of them, between them talking at that level, they decided they'd try to send a young man from Canada to Russia. It was easier in Canada because had not been involved in Vietnam. We'd been involved in Korea, but we weren't really the prime focus the way the U.S. and Russia were as antagonists. So this was sort of arranged at that level, and then through the ministries of health, and finally I got the invitation and the visa. Now, the visa was very difficult to get, and it didn't come, and it didn't come. My wife and I were on the boat, or at least getting on the boat to go to Europe and Russia before the embassy came down and said, here's your visa. So we had our visa, and we ended up in Moscow for about 2 months, mainly at the Institute of Thoracic Surgery, Institut Grudnoy Chirurgie. With Vasily Burakovsky, who was looking after me. And the Ministry of Health in Russia treated us very well. My wife was given permission, she's a school teacher, to visit the schools and see how they were done. I was allowed to do whatever I wanted. I had tried to learn Russian, but I only had about 3 months, so I could read it, which is, first you have to get that alphabet right. You're lost. Everything's Cyrillic. And it's not a difficult language to speak, but I was not fluent in it. And my time in Moscow and Kiev and Leningrad was very happy. I was treated well. People were all very kind to me. The great problem was the men in power, the men in the 50s and 60s, only a few of them would speak English. So you had to have an interpreter for that. And I had a ministry interpreter with me some of the time. My main memory of Moscow is that my best friend was a man from Beijing, because he spoke perfect English, and he was there in Moscow training and observing like I was, and we got on very well. When we left, I wrote to him 2 or 3 times, but no letters ever went through, so I never heard from that. And similarly, the people I knew in Moscow or Leningrad, I wrote to them, no letters went through in the 60s. And if they were being very friendly with anybody in the West, they were suspect too. So it was a very interesting time to observe what was going on, because militarily, the West and Russia were sort of at a stalemate, but in terms of what they were actually doing and the life of the people, there was no comparison. You know, they didn't own a home, they didn't own a car, they ate well, they dressed well enough. The subways were unbelievable, the airplanes were good, but it was a controlled society, and you had to we had to have permission to take our trip down to Kiev, which we got, and similarly to Leningrad. But we'll never forget the exit from Russia. We were met at our hotel the day we were leaving, a beautiful hotel. We were treated well, as I said. We had Bolshoi tickets, we had Tretyakov Gallery tickets, all that stuff. And I observed surgery and got on very well with them. So we were leaving, and I guess whether he's a Ministry of Health man or KGB, I don't know. He met us at the hotel and escorted us down to the train station in Leningrad, same one Lenin had come in on in 1917, and we got on the train and headed up to Helsinki. And as we got near the border, in came the conductor with two soldiers, you know, submachine guns. Looked at our passports, expert visa, and said okay, and on we went across the border, and then comes a little Finn saying, "Welcome to Finland." We've never forgotten that to this day. It was leaving a closed society to an open society.
What year was that?
This would be 1960.
1960. Can you remember what operations the Russians were doing at that time? Were they using Dacron grass for aortic aneurysm?
They were attempting it. They were behind. And the Russians are very intelligent, very capable people, as we're all aware. But the war had been going on, the Cold War had been going on. So they were on what's called the American strategic list. They couldn't get an American heart-lung pump, so they had a Swedish one. I'm sure they couldn't get American grafts, so they had whatever was made in Europe. So they were doing the operations that we were doing, but they were not in the forefront the way USA and Canada were in these operations. They were doing them very well.
Oh, yeah.
They were excellent surgeons.
When you think back now over your long and varied and interesting career, were there low points in it? Or any low points that you can recall that you sort of overcame, or as a way of thinking about
I think,
advice for younger people?
In general, accept your opportunities. I lived at a fascinating time, and the opportunities were just unbelievable. They've changed now. The young men who are young, and women. I trained the foremost Canadian female surgeons right across the country, as did my predecessor, Dr. Bigelow. And the women surgeons, of course, were superb. They got better hands than we have when it comes to small vessels, of course.
Well-known fact.
And they're conflicted by their lifestyle and what society expects of them and so on. So, no, I have, we would have some turf fights, but that's natural. The government interference in Canada, Medicare and hospitals, is of great interest, because that's the main difference now between U.S. and Canada. We have a superb Medicare system. You guys are squabbling over what you're going to have. And there's tremendous misunderstanding. And that's my whole life has been watching that happen. The war ends in 1945. USA and Canada are very rich. The rest of the world's in shambles. And there's a lot of socialism going around. Attlee replaces Churchill. The Beveridge Report comes into Great Britain, and they nationalize their healthcare system. All their doctors become civil servants. Tremendous unrest. That's 46, 47. So it starts in Canada too, but it starts very slowly, and it starts with a guy called Tommy Douglas, who is the grandfather of Kiefer Sutherland. And he's a socialist. He gets elected in Saskatchewan, and he decides he's going to nationalize the hospitals, which he does, in the one province. And that's in 46, and everybody wonders how that's going to happen, but it's not bad. He makes it pay and makes it work, and over the next 15 years, it spreads across Canada. So it comes into Toronto, into Ontario, by about 1960. And suddenly all the hospitals are owned by the government. Now that's a tremendous change. So suddenly the nurses are paid as civil servants. They stop the nursing schools. They go to college. There are no big wards anymore. Every hospital becomes like a hotel. Mm-hmm. Money doesn't matter anymore. So whatever you need and equipment and all the rest is provided. What happens, of course, is the politicians get in control. And slowly the medical profession realizes it's not running the hospitals anymore. So that was true up until 60. Well then, in 1960, Tommy Douglas decides he's going to nationalize the medical profession and make them civil servants. And that's 1960 in Saskatchewan, leads to a doctor's strike. And he imports a lot of doctors from Britain to break that strike. Anyway, there's some toing and froing, and the situation settles down. Slowly that spreads across the country. The Canadian Medical Association did not like the idea of a strike of doctors. Mm-hmm. And so they approached the Prime Minister, at that time a fellow called John Diefenbaker, and said, look, let's get a commission to find out what the people of Canada want in terms of medical care. Now this is 1960. The timing is perfect, because for the first time we're going to be able to do something. Mm-hmm. Hips are coming in, hip replacement, knee replacement, open heart surgery. Before that we hadn't done much. Mm-hmm. That was expensive.
And not much expensive.
Yeah,
right.
So this is huge. Anyway, so the whole commission goes right across the country and hears reports, but instead of suggesting a system where private insurance continues, it was all private insurance then, they suggest a national insurance policy. Well, that causes problems too. Now in Canada also, we're always having problems between Francophone Canada and Anglophone Canada. And Quebec doesn't want to do what the rest of the country wants to do. And that was, in the 60s, that was a very big issue. So Quebec didn't want to join in that sort of thing. When they did join, that's 1970, they bring it in very draconian fashion, that every doctor becomes a civil servant. Mm-hmm. So that leads to another strike. That's the Quebec strike. Oh, yeah. And that was a nasty strike. It still hadn't come to Toronto. We had a partial insurance, but by the late 60s it came into Ontario because the federal government had the purse strings, and they said, if you don't do this system, we won't give you all this money. So. Mm-hmm. By the mid-60s, we were being paid for by the government. And there was a little friction then. There was a strike in the mid-80s in Ontario, but that didn't last long. Once the discussion went on back and forth, everything gets modified. So now, I'm talking now 2011, we have a fascinating system. The doctors are happy, they're being paid all sorts of money, I think better than in the US. Patients are happy, everything's free. I've had my bowel out and I'm getting treatment for my macular. Everything doesn't cost me zip. The only people who are unhappy are the government, because 70 to 80 cents of every dollar is going into health. And they haven't got any money for the roads or education or nothing. So obviously we're going to have to swing back to some sort of more private input.
Yeah. Yes.
But it's been a fascinating scene. And then to watch the debates as they've gone on here in the United States is just absolutely fascinating. And a lot of Canadians can't understand it because we don't understand the difference between federal rights and states' rights, which are far more important here than they are up in Canada.
Yes, they are. So in there are many lessons for the United States.
Well,
if we
lessons,
were to look,
we can't go around preaching stuff. The Canadian likes to preach, I can tell you what you need to do.
That's right.
That doesn't get you anywhere. No, it's fascinating to see. And, my daughter is a PhD in Russian history, by the way. But she lives in Atlanta and works for Southern Bell. And so I get the real dope on the U.S. health system from her. More so than I get from my colleagues who have a slant on it, or the Canadian visitor who comes down here and gets caught with a huge bill. He has a slant on it.
Yeah, that's right. Listen, tell me a little bit about some of the things you've done besides medical and surgical in your life. You've done a lot of other things too.
Well, I've been lucky, as I say. I think my interest in history came from the Russian trip, because after that I became very interested in the history of Europe, England, USA. I love USA history. My kids have been to all your battlefields, Gettysburg on. I've been to Jimmy Carter's library, been to Kennebunkport to see where George Bush lives, been to Paris Island, see the Marines, West Point. The U.S. experience has been fascinating for the whole world, of course. And the U.S. power is fascinating. I don't know, you didn't ask to suddenly become the most powerful country in the world after 1945, but you were.
That's right.
Not only the most powerful, the richest. And you had to look after Germany, you had to look after Japan, and then the sad conflicts that, like Vietnam, what's gone on the last few years happened. Nobody has a clear version of where the most powerful country should go and how long it should try to remain the most powerful, or how big an army it should have, and so on. So that's all fascinating. And Canadians, of course, sit there and look at this and laugh it up because we're only 10% of the size. So a lot of these things are things we couldn't win about anyway.
That's right. You have done some farming in your time.
Yeah. Well, I was lucky in that too. My children were born in the early 60s, and that's when a lot of societal changes started to happen, and schooling became lousy, and permissiveness and all that stuff. So we decided we would get them out of the city on the weekends and so on. And so we bought a country place, and it's turned out to be a great resource. I had about 200 acres. I had cattle, horses, a lot of water. We spent our summers there, and the children all loved it and still love it. And I'm reduced now to 30 acres, so I'm a grass cutter, and I'm a gardener, and that sort of thing.
Do you do some hunting and fishing up there?
Oh, I grew up in a strict religious sect called Plymouth Brethren. So we had no hunting, no radio, no Boy Scouts, no nothing. And we didn't have the money to travel for that sort of thing. It's when I began to have the benefits of being a doctor and meeting people that suddenly I was able to go on fishing trips and hunting trips and riding and so on. So it was new to me, and I enjoyed it. More the ambience than the actual hunting or catching fish. But we've been in Labrador and up in the Pacific catching salmon and a lot of places. My children greatly enjoyed it also.
Yeah. Were your parents involved with medicine?
No. My father worked as a porter on the railroad. And only had a grade 8 education. My mother was an American, as I think I mentioned to you. She was from Pennsylvania, and she had a post-high school education. But they were both members of this religious sect, and we never had a car. We weren't living it up in those days, but they made sure that I got educated.
Oh, that's great. Do you have any advice for younger surgeons in vascular surgery?
Not really.
Not really.
I'm amazed at how many things have changed. And I think as I see it, and I see it only locally, it's still a satisfying life. And none of them are going to get rich. They better realize that off the beginning. You know, people in medicine traditionally throughout the ages have made a decent living, but if they get greedy, then they're going to be unhappy. The tremendous society changes that have made the profession mostly female are still playing out. I don't know how that's going to happen, but all my doctors are women, including the surgeon who took out my bowel. No, so life keeps changing. I don't really have any advice for them, except to say, keep working.
You have trained a number of surgeons over your career. Do you want to talk about a few of them?
Well, we were fortunate, again, with the wealth of the city and the wealth of Canada, and our proximity and acceptance by U.S. You know, you form a vascular society and you invite us in. That's a tremendous privilege. So we've had the best of all worlds. Both Dr. Bigelow and I had contacts with Japanese. Now, the Japanese recovered rapidly after the war, but they weren't particularly acceptable in the United States. quite naturally after the Second World War. So they flocked to Canada. We must have had over 100 students come up over from Japan. And we had a number come up from the United States and Latin America, etc. And I enjoyed training them all. The licensing differences between the USA and Canada are not great. So people could move back and forth without much trouble. I greatly enjoyed the young people and helping them. You mentioned earlier, you know, about assisting, if I can get onto that.
Yes.
Because I retired when I was 64. And I retired because my results were not as good as my younger people.
Oh, yeah.
And that happens as your eyesight goes and your other things begin to go, and perhaps because you're no longer the chief. Mm-hmm. When you're not the chief, you don't get the best resident, you don't get the best anesthetist.
Yeah.
Anyway, I decided, well, enough's enough, and I retired. And I was able to work as an assistant. Now, why would that be acceptable? And it's acceptable for several reasons. If you're kind to them on your way up, they'll treat you well on your way down. That was true. I was well looked after. Also, the payment system in Canada meant I wasn't in their hair.
Oh, I see.
Government paid my bill. You know, the surgeon didn't have to worry whether I was being paid or getting a percentage of his fee. And so that was true. Also, coronary bypass, taken over cardiac surgery. Mm-hmm. And we were doing them $1,200, $1,500 a year at the Toronto General Hospital. So it was like an assembly line. And everybody had his own anesthetist, his own first assistant, and really his own nurse, 5 rooms going. There was plenty of room for me to move around as an assistant with the people who were happy to have me. Certain surgeons, I wouldn't be in their room, of course, because they wouldn't be comfortable with me being there. But others weren't. So that went on. A day a week, 2 days a week was a nice way to ease into retirement, which I did until I was 72, when I finally stopped working. I'm almost 82 now, and I'm still healthy, so I wouldn't mind working still, but they don't really want me down.
Listen, thank you very much, Dr. Baird. It's just been a pleasure to hear all your reflections on your career, and thank you for participating in this program.
Thank you very much.